Hello there, Blue Mask Man here, and this is a short tutorial on how to do basic lighting for Cinema 4D. Let's go. So the first thing you have is a omnidirectional light. This points in all directions and for the most part works very well. Next you have a spotlight. This is exactly how it sounds, just like a spotlight on stage. These are most useful for spotlight on stages. What this can also be useful for are roof lights. Like if you don't want to use an omnidirectional light source, you're going to want to have a light source that only goes up to 180 degrees. So here, this can prove to be a very useful kind of light when it comes to situations like this. Another example of how a spotlight can be useful is from car lights. If you use a spotlight instead of an omni light, the spotlight can provide a much more narrow kind of light source than the omni would, and give you better control over how you want the shadows to show up, and so forth. Next, you have infinite light sources. Just like how it suggests, it serves primarily as the sun. I don't know what kind of application you would find this for other kinds of sources or stuff, but 9 times out of 10 I always see the directional light used as a sun. Next we have a area light. What the area light is kind of like the omni light, except there's a big old crease of darkness right in the middle where it's generating the light. This can be useful for squarish kind of sources like this. Just put that there, generate us a shadow thing. It can serve as something like this, although depending on how you use it, it can greatly vary on how you use it properly. So that covers the basic of lights, well, the different kinds of lights in the most simple way I can put it, and to my knowledge. Let's go over shadows. So earlier I was using a area shadow. These kinds of shadows, they spread over time, and they mimic real world light sources. If you notice, no light is sharp as all hell when there's a shadow generating it from it 20 miles away. We would have a very ugly world if there was no shadow dissipation. Next we have hard shadows. These are the kind of shadows I was just describing if our world had them. There's no dissipation, they're extremely sharp, and they're only useful for, well, if you want to do some cheap rendering with them. I personally use them a lot because I don't have that good of a rig, but I also tend to use area shadows, and I just tone down the quality of them severely. If you do it right, it can look pretty good. Next you have soft shadows. These are the kind of shadows you see in video games, where the kind of shadow where it slowly gets harder and harder towards the umbra of the shadow. Now in Cinema 4D, you can configure it to be more and more hard, but you can also increase how soft it is at higher resolutions. The sample radius being the main way of doing that. But the more sample radius you use at higher qualities, the longer it takes to render. So if you were to use a very small shadow map and a high sample radius, this will cause it to do that. If you use a small shadow map and a very small sample radius, you can get yourself some very cheap shadows to render, and if you know what you're doing, it can look like total ass. Soft shadows do not dissipate over time. They stay at their softness and hardness settings, and they just stay like that. You can't change the resolution here though, so that's nice. Moving on from shadows, I'm gonna go over volumetric lighting. In Cinema 4D, you have 3 types of visible lights: visible, volumetric, and inverse volumetric. Visible is a very simple and cheap kind of visible light. It's kind of like a glare or something, like a little bit of a sun object or something. Yeah, and with this kind of light, you'd want to use at like the end of like you want to have a very bright light source outside, or you're gonna want to have a bit of glowing at the end of a hallway or something. It's a nice cheap effect, and it doesn't affect the environment. Next we have volumetric lighting. This is where it will generate a three-dimensional shadow based on what is colliding with it with inside of the volumetric lighting, as shown here. Now volumetric lighting is very expensive to render. The higher quality you make it and the bigger you make it. Down here you have the quality settings of your volumetric lighting. By default it's 25%, 100% brightness, and dust and dithering are at 0%. The lower you go, the higher quality the volumetric lighting goes, but the more expensive it gets. The higher the value, the opposite effect. So here we have, this can be used for a number of applications. Mainly you'd want, the most I see it is showing off how great a figure is. You want to make volumetric cloud lighting, heaven rays and stuff like that. Or maybe it's a very bright light source from outside, and you want to show, you want to add a little bit of atmosphere with just how bright it is, and something is casting a shadow from the outside. And last up for visible light would be the inverse volumetric light. This does the same thing for the volumetric light, except it's, well, reversed. Instead of a visible light all around and it generates a dark shadow from whatever is penetrating it, it does the opposite effect. It creates a white shadow, or whatever the color of the light is, but it doesn't show the visible light except for whatever is colliding with it. So we covered the basics of lighting with shadows and visible lighting of it. Now we can go into some more advanced techniques of lighting, like global illumination and indirect lighting. We will start off with indirect lighting. This requires global illumination, indirect shading. The only reasons you're going to want to create indirect lighting is if the usual methods of lighting do not work in your favor. This is usually more expensive to render, and depending on how you do it, it can either look worse than the traditional lighting effects, or it can look better. Indirect lighting requires the luminance tag in the material, and in order to tweak how strong it is, you're going to want to go to this little spot here, generate GI, the strength and saturation. The higher the strength, the stronger it will generate an indirect light source, and the more it can create some interesting effects that other lights that can't do it. Another thing of indirect lighting is GI area light. When you have luminance enabled, you can now enable this, where basically the renderer will dedicate more time to more sampling for this, so that it creates cleaner render. So it creates cleaner shadows and overall cleaner lighting. Here is without area lights. Here is with area lights. So that's indirect lighting. Now let's go into the global illumination settings itself. Now by default you have a radiance cache. It's usually at normal. It's usually at medium for both samples and record density, and at 50% smoothing. Also by default is autosave for the cache. I recommend not turning this on, as this can slow down rendering, as it has to now cache all the GI per frame so that it can be used later. But this is only useful if nothing in your scene moves whatsoever. Now in R15 and above, Maxon introduced a radiance cache. It's a cleaner, more effective way of rendering your GI scenes, where it creates a better sense of ambient occlusion, creates better shadows, and so forth. Prior to R15, you have Legacy Edition of the GI. Both Legacy and the newer versions of GI, a radiance cache, have their ups and downs. Depending on the scene and what you're doing, you may want to switch back and forth using each one. If you're an older user of radiance cache, you may know some good tricks in being able to get weak rendering settings in, but keeping the scene to look good. Now, something that the newer Radiance cache can take advantage of that the older one can't are these two new options: discrete area sampling and discrete sky sampling. Now, discrete area sampling is kind of self-explanatory, but I'll just give a quick rundown of it. Where enabling this will force per pixel of indirect light sources to create a higher quality kind of lighting. Now here you can see that is contradicting what I just said, as it's creating some grainy as all hell shadows. So if we were to up this severely, you can see it is taking much more time in order to render, but you can also see that the graininess of the shadows and the lighting has severely went down and the quality has gone up. Sky sampling is, well, you know, when lighting comes from the sky itself. So we just drop in the sky here. The sky kind of helps here with generating some additional GI and overall adding additional light balances that without a sky things can look really dark and just overall ugly. So that's all I have for lighting in Cinema 4D. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to comment, favorite, share, subscribe, share, whatever. Bye.